Hello, good afternoon, good morning. Just got some folks joining here. It's great to see you all. Welcome, welcome. Okay, we are very excited to have your time today. I'm going to share some slides by way of introduction and have an opportunity to introduce our speakers today and my colleague who is co-hosting with me today. So hi again, welcome. I see folks are still trickling in, but my name is Lauren Cooper. I'm a Chief Conservation Officer here at SFI, and I'm very happy to be co-hosting this webinar today on our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative, where we have a focus on our Indigenous-led Climate Smart Forestry today. So this is a really important aspect of our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative. I'll give a little more insight on that. And I'm really delighted to be co-hosting this today with Jeffrey Ross, who's our advisor on forest carbon and climate, and he'll have an opportunity to introduce himself more fully in a moment and lead that a bit of our intro here and the key part of our engagement. Today we are going to be focusing on Indigenous-led projects in Canada. So we have at SFI, our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative cuts across both our US and Canadian footprint, but we have a really special focus on our Canadian footprint. And the First Nations are a key partner and collaborator in our major grant that we have supported by Environment and Climate Change Canada. So this webinar is an opportunity to hear updates from our initiative. And we're really excited to highlight the work of Leigh Fox and Shayna Mason from Wakatoan, or Leigh Fox is from Wakatoan Development, who is leading up some really amazing work in forestry that we'll be hearing about today, and a number of projects that we're really interested in partnering with, and one that we're supporting directly with our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative. Shayna Mason from Chucho Forestry will be sharing their work with biodiversity implications. So really excited to hear from her today and learn a little bit more about that project and its growth into the future. And so just a little bit more again on our speakers. Shane is going to be providing insights on their work, which is looking at caribou specifically and forage responses to varying tree planting densities. And Leigh will be highlighting the work that they do on silvicultural tactics and Indigenous leadership for improved forestry, climate, and biodiversity outcomes. And I know they look at a range of different tactics, and he'll be highlighting some specific ones that we're supporting with our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative. I do want to highlight, if you're not familiar, that the Sustainable Forestry Initiative has a forest management standard, and this is kind of a foundational to our work in our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative, is this entry point of our forest management standards. This is why we're engaging in this space. You can see over here, Objective 9 is Climate Smart Forestry. So in our last standards revision, we elevated the topic of climate change that was embedded throughout our forest management standard to its own objective. And so this has given us on the conservation team a real mandate to advance our work in climate change mitigation and adaptation. So these are explicit requirements in our standard now. And so we have launched this initiative to advance and improve an understanding of mitigation and adaptation, what the strategies look like on the ground and implementation, how to measure and assess these strategies for improved forest resilience. And it's given us an opportunity to attract funds and resources to advance this work. And we're, of course, thinking of the implementation of our standard, but it's also given us a great opportunity to expand our partnerships. So beyond our certified footprint and our current certified organizations. And again, we have this particular focus on Indigenous partnerships as part of this work. And I just want to take a moment, I'm happy to share this afterwards, but this is part of our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative, is kind of unpacking a range of strategies and tactics that a forest decision maker may take in support of mitigation or adaptation. So mitigation, again, is limiting or reducing the emissions that are coming from forestry operations. That could be from your fossil fuel use in your machinery, your transportation, but it also could be reducing the risk of catastrophic fire, which of course is then releasing the carbon stored in the forests and in the different forest carbon pools. So we're advancing work to clarify what's the input information that can go to support this decision making, everything from vulnerability assessments to your greenhouse gas inventory. And then from there, there's a range of strategies and interventions that a forest decision maker can take. So I wanted to put this up for a moment to just emphasize this is the approach that we're taking in our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative, trying to unpack this space, which can seem kind of overwhelming, or that there's different decisions, and we're kind of sometimes we're talking about reforestation and sometimes we're talking about dealing with fire, and how do we think about these side by side. And we want to emphasize that in fact strategies can be layered or thought of in tandem, or may be appropriate even different strategies across a single forest management unit or a certain scale. And so I encourage us to kind of think of what are these intervention options and these management strategies that we're hearing from our partners that we'll be presenting today. And then this is my last slide, and I'll hand it over to my colleague, Jeffrey. This is a really exciting project. So I've mentioned our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative. In Canada, we have some really amazing support from Environment and Climate Change Canada to advance this work. We currently have a 3-year project to identify, develop, and implement climate smart practices and strategies. So again, going back to that conceptual figure, these are how we started to build out and advance those strategies. And what we'll be hearing from our partners today is how they're taking an Indigenous-led approaches to advance their own priorities and projects on the landscape. And then our responsibility is to kind of pull out and draw some additional linkages of what are lessons that we can scale or learn from these strategies to improve and enhance mitigation and adaptation across the forest sector. So we have a range of strategies in this project, including interpreting climate risk and opportunity, advancing what we're calling principles and practices for climate smart forestry. We have resources for workshopping. And then strategy number 5, I'll point out here, is this particular focus on Indigenous knowledges, values, and partnerships. So this is where we have a re-granting mechanism as part of this grant to elevate those practices and support them. And so that's kind of the framing for what we'll hear today from our partners that are generously giving us some of their time to share their insights and their projects. And if you're interested in learning more about this, we can drop a link in the chat to sign up for our newsletter, because we certainly have like workshops and engagement opportunities. And we'd love to loop you into our work if you're interested. So we'll drop that into the chat. But for now, I'll hand it over to Jeffrey, who will talk a little more about this work, this emphasis on our Indigenous partners, and he'll also touch on our current funding opportunity that we'd love to bring to your attention as well.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Lauren mentioned, my name is Jeffrey Ross. I am actually Anishinaabe from Northwest Angle 33 First Nation in the Treaty 3 territory of Northwestern Ontario, but currently reside in Nelson, British Columbia, and I am an advisor to SFI on forest carbon and climate. So yeah, I just want to expand a little bit more on the strategy 5. These are the flow-through funds that we have available to our First Nation partners. In March of this past year, we had initial call for RFPs to identify some projects. Just skip forward. All right. As I was mentioning, in March, we had released an expression of interest for our first round of funding. We funded 8 projects through this. 5 of them were seed funding opportunities, which we provided some capacity support to First Nations to further develop their ideas into a full proposal and resubmit for our next call, which I'll talk about shortly. And then there was 3 shovel-ready projects that we funded at higher levels, and 2 of those you're going to hear about today from Shayna and Leigh. And so we weren't really being prescriptive at that time on what Indigenous-led climate smart forestry practices were, and we still aren't. But we were just looking for kind of new things and novel ideas to fund. So things around silvicultural practices for caribou, alternatives to slash pile burning, alternatives to herbicide. So these were just some of the projects that we funded, and there will be a full report. And I think there has been a news release of all of those projects that have been funded. I also want to mention that in May of this year, we held a session in conjunction with a Silva 21 meeting in Sherbrooke, Quebec. We invited some of our funded projects and other Indigenous partners. And as part of that, we had a half-day workshop to discuss what does climate smart or Indigenous-led climate smart forestry look like. And we came up with sort of one key priority is that Indigenous-led climate resilient forest stewardship ensures long-term environmental and cultural resilience. And to achieve that, there was 4 actions that were identified out of those discussions: supporting sustainable community-led economic development, centering Indigenous leadership and values in forestry, advancing community-led forest monitoring, and investing in long-term capacity building for Indigenous-led climate smart forestry. And we'll have a full report coming out soon because this has been sent to all the participants for further validation and verification before we can share it. So as Lauren said, we just in July released our second call for funding. We have up to $150,000 per year, up to 2 years, so maximum 300,000. But these are for projects that are ready at the implementation stage. So costs that can be covered are just forest management planning, field staff costs, material costs, data collection. Just things that we won't fund are like capital costs. So if you need some expensive machinery, that's something unfortunately we will not cover through this grant. But again, what we're really looking for is kind of the forest and land use information, biodiversity and ecosystem impacts, social and economic cultural outcomes, and financial and implementation summaries. But what we're really looking at is projects that are going to really ensure that forests are resilient to climate change or a change in climate. And so looking at what impacts does your project have on overall forest health and biodiversity and other factors. What is the forest management planning process going to look like after the implementation of your project? So these are just some of the things that we're looking at. And so, again, we're currently accepting submissions. They are rolling submissions now. We had begun reviewing some proposals last month, and we're ready to make some awards next week. But we still have significant funds that are available, and so we will be continuing to identify and work with our Indigenous partners in the future here. So our first speaker is Shayna Mason. So our next presenter is Leigh Fox from Wakota Development, who also is a seed grant, or not a seed grant, a shovel-ready grant recipient from our first round of funding. And they're going to talk about the project they're working on. And just want to give Shayna a big shout out for your presentation. I think we're going to have lots of questions for you. Leigh, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And thanks for the presentation, Shayna, when you were talking about flexible spacing. That speaks to my tree planter heart. Okay, let me know when you can see this. Okay. Hi, everybody. As Jeffrey mentioned, my name is Leigh Fox. My official title with Wokotowin is Conservation Finance Catalyst, which is a fancy way of saying I help to organize and structure finance and do business development for a number of projects that Wokotowin is engaged in. We were a grant recipient for SFI, from SFI, sorry, for the first round. And our work was around silviculture tactics and Indigenous leadership for improved forestry, climate, and biodiversity outcomes. So I'm going to go through a little bit about Wokotowin and then get into the project and some of the work that we did this summer up in Chapleau, Ontario. So Wokotowin Development is a private company owned by 3 First Nations in Northern Ontario: Chapleau Cree First Nation, Missinaba Cree First Nation, and Brunswick House First Nation. Diversified investments, either through Wokotowin or individually or as a group with the nations. We own a harvesting company, part of a sawmill, a cogen, spun up a not-for-profit housing solution. And a lot of the work within the GP is around nature-based climate solutions. We do policy work with federal and provincial governments. We're the lead on a mycorrhizal inoculation of forest seedlings project that has federal funding to plant 53 million trees. We've inoculated 35 million to date, and I'll touch on this project a little bit more. We're part of a pilot cohort for Verra's Nature Framework, and that project also connects to this grant and the herbicide alternative work that we've been engaged in. Wokotowin also runs a youth guardian program, and for the topic of today in climate smart forestry and operationalizing this in the forest sector, I think it's important to highlight that the monitoring, reporting, and verification work that needs to go into these types of projects to make them operate and generate revenue, or just be deployed on the landscape, however the finance is structured, is perfect work for land guardians. So the way that Wokotowin's thinking about a lot of this work, and you'll hear about tree planting and brushing, is in conjunction with other work on the land that connects to carbon projects and biodiversity projects. If there are trained local land guardian crews that have trucks and safety plans and know how to use Avenza and follow the blue dot, they can take on more than just the seasonal work that's the traditional silviculture. The Guardian program's in its 5th year of operation, and one of the key sort of pieces of Wokotowin's work is around sovereignty and cultural revitalization, and that is cross-cutting in everything that we do. Just a photo from this summer. Wokotowin has built 5 birch bark canoes, and we bring in a master canoe builder, and the Guardians go out to the forest and collect the materials and process them and build a birch bark canoe. So this is the launching ceremony on the Chapleau River. So specifically with this Climate Smart Forestry grant and testing silviculture tactics, and you might ask, what does that mean? And I see a couple of our partners on the call that were a part of this work. Green First Forest Products and Interfor are consortium partners, both in the mycorrhizal inoculation project and do work on the herbicide alternative program. So we all know where the grant came from. It's SFI deploying ECCC money as flow through. The theory of change in our grant is that a highly trained workforce can better deliver more sophisticated prescriptions and achieve better results for forest companies. So thinking about where the win-wins are. The herbicide alternative program that some folks on the call here attended convened 35 forestry professionals for a 3-day field workshop to review tactics and demonstrate chainsaw brushing, hardwood management, pre-harvest vegetation assessment surveying. These are all activities that, if coordinated, can help support the reduction or elimination of herbicide as a tool in working forest landscapes. So, to manage forests, you need to manage for your crop trees, and you need to, at times, remove competition brush. The community's position is that herbicide should never be used. We also recognize that just cutting it off has implications for the health of forests and forest management and timber supply. and for biodiversity. And so we're looking at alternatives. The work that we did with the SFI funding brought in some experts, and most of my silviculture planting career is out on the West Coast, and I brought in a friend of mine and colleague that has 30 years of experience in hardwood management, brush management, both spraying and a lot of chainsaw brushing. And so we had a series of meetings leading up to the in-person sessions and talking about what sort of things can help reduce the need to use herbicide. And so manual brushing is one, but there's a cost implication of that that's significantly more than the aerial application of glyphosate. And so recognizing that bringing in crews from outside is very expensive, and oftentimes, regardless of the price that you're willing to pay, which forest companies in the present state don't have in their silviculture funds to be able to do, you just can't find the crews. So part of the theory of change is training local guardians. And so the picture you're looking at here is a demonstration of some chainsaw brushing, taking on some aspen out on a cut block that's about 7 or 8 years old. And this is one of the sites that we went on a tour with the larger group to talk about what could be done. And I think one of the successes of the program was that we were able to convene government researchers, policymakers, certification organizations. SFI had some folks there, and community and industry to just have a frank conversation about what can we do and what are the needs and what does everybody need out of a solution. We want this to be able to scale. We want this to be used and useful. So manual brushing is one potential part of the solution. Unlikely to all of a sudden stand up crews that can go across 6 million hectares and brush 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 hectares a year. So we're looking at other tactics, and one of them is pre-harvest vegetation assessment. And without getting into too much detail, what this means is if you know what's in the forest and the state and the condition of the block before you harvest it, you can better design a silviculture system and a brush risk index to take measures to avoid herbicide. This is something that's expensive and that forest companies don't necessarily have the resources or personnel to do, but again, something that land guardians could take on. And as connected to biodiversity finance, if we're avoiding herbicide, this is something that Wacotowin can help facilitate and pay for and improve the outcomes for forest companies. I'm going to move a little bit quicker through some of this other project work. Connected to the herbicide alternative program is a carbon project, carbon and biodiversity project that I mentioned in the intro. It's mycorrhizal fungi inoculated onto forest seedlings. There's a 15 to 45% increase in stand volume. For jack pine, it's an average of 30. For spruces, it's in the 13 to 18 range. We're looking to commercialize this. This is what the grant from the federal government is about, and targeting inoculation of over 100 million trees a year, that the ownership of the carbon and biodiversity rights vest to the local First Nations. That's our principle, and that's something that we'd like to execute on and be able to have enough value for the forest companies and stand volume increase in survival, increase in site occupancy, reduction of silviculture costs, and the carbon and biodiversity or ecosystem benefits in terms of revenue go to the local First Nations. Mentioned emerging biodiversity credit market. We're part of the nature framework. So on the left is the soon to be available to the public. It was announced at the Convention on Biological Diversity in Cali, Colombia last year. And this is about avoided loss of biodiversity or restoring biodiversity. The next round of their development is going to be nature stewardship certificates and maintaining intact biodiversity. So this all has implications for future finance streams and Indigenous-led Climate Smart Forestry, and lots of connections to be made there. So this is the SDTC project consortium. A couple of the major forest companies in Ontario that are involved as consortium partners, and some of the individual SFLs that are more joint ventures with First Nations and other stakeholders, with operators that are Green First or Interfor. Microtech is the name of the technology company, and the tree nursery you're looking at there is in Pitt Meadows down in the Lower Mainland outside of Vancouver, and they grow a lot of the trees in BC that end up coming to Ontario. So we were down there inoculating. Some policy work that we're doing, and I was on an SFI hosted panel at the Indigenous Forestry Conference in BC recently, and this work is getting a lot of traction on the policy side. And think about the forest sector as timber production and a separate asset class being ecosystem services. So if you're thinking about how the heck are we going to finance all of this great work that Indigenous communities want to do if these grants aren't around to develop and commercialize it, what we're thinking about is carbon offsets, biodiversity credits, water stewardship, land stewardship, all of those bundled into a category of ecosystem services, and that those are a separate finance stream that can support the forest industry, but are separate from the investment into timber production. And I think there's a lot of interest in this as an orientation to better sustainable forest management. And I think that that's something likely shared by many on the call, that we can do better at sustainable forest management, and that Indigenous communities are the right groups to lead in what some of those solutions are. This is a block on the Sunshine Coast that we chainsaw brush. So just a bit of a background. This is a treatment that is expensive. It has a high impact, and the maple tree that's in the foreground there, the prescription called for single stemming of maple. So that hardwood component wasn't lost from the stand. It just removed some of the competition from around the crop trees. This is the type of thing that if we wanted to enhance the treatments, if we wanted to look at retaining stand structure, the herbicide program keeps more biomass and more diversity above ground. And we're doing some research right now on the impacts of spray on the below ground environment. It's likely that avoiding herbicide keeps more carbon and biodiversity below ground as well. And I'll just wrap up with something that this is from our planting program this summer, and this again was funded partly by SFI in the workforce development. If we're going to implement increasingly sophisticated prescriptions, if we're going to have cut at the stump practices where the blocks are harder to connect to Shayna's work and looking at variable prescriptions and being more specific about what needs to happen, you need trained planters. And the vast majority of planters in Northern Ontario are rookies, and they move on to somewhere else every year. And so our initiative is to train local guardians and local community members in tree planting so that they can have a regular seasonal work every year. And this is Santana, one of the land guardians from Brunswick House. And we did something that I've never done before planting, and we smudged the trees and brought ceremony to tree planting. And it was Santana's request and the other guardians. And then another thing, and I've been a tree planter for 26 years, and I've trained a lot of people in planting. And what happens, and I'm sure lots on the call can relate to this, when a rookie kind of gets it a little bit, knows how to put a tree in the ground and wants to go faster, all of a sudden the quality falls off a cliff. You walk into their piece and they're like, well, I planted 1,800 trees today, and there's trees hanging out of holes and open holes. And I didn't see that when I was training as the guardian sped up. And I asked Santana about that. And she said, well, yeah, this is our home territory, and I see them like little spirits. So why would I plant a bad tree? And so I'll leave you with that as an orientation towards what happens when there's local folks. Santana didn't leave a dirt road or a bush road to go from her house to this block. And there's a lot of care in what happens out there, and a lot of interest in what's going on and in participating in that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and welcome a connection or questions to follow.
All right, thanks for that, Leigh. Greatly appreciated. Um, got a couple questions coming in. One's a comment, but I think it ties to the question because there was a comment that in the province of Quebec, herbicide application hasn't been allowed on public land since 2001. So, as a follow-up question, were alternative tools or processes considered aside from chainsaw brushing? Just because if Quebec's been able to do this since 2001, have you sort of looked at what Quebec's doing and how they're managing? Um,
Yeah, so my understanding with Quebec is that, and I would take tune-up or coaching on this from those that are more knowledgeable than me, that there was a hard ban on herbicide, and that the Quebec government is financing the manual brushing. And so it's like for those that are familiar with the countervailing duties and the tariffs and the softwood lumber taxes basically that are put on the border, part of that is around the claim that Canada subsidizes its industry. The other piece of that is a question around, is that sustainable in the long term for the government to be paying for a private company's sustainable forest management? And then there's another piece in that I'm not exactly sure what the prescriptions are, but I've heard that Quebec's brushing prescriptions are quite vigorous, shall we say, and everything comes down to a 2-inch stump. And so it's mimicking the herbicide without the herbicide, so the effect. And what we're looking at is how to brush and again, this is more expensive at most cases than completely knocking everything down, but how to retain as much hardwood component on the landscape, how to look at it as a species by species thing, where if it's a cherry and it's less than 60% or 80% the height of the crop tree, leave it alone if it's outside of 1 meter. And being able to vary it like that. So I'd welcome kind of conversation around what's going on in Quebec and that experience. Um, and then alternative tools or processes considered aside from chainsaw brushing. I think that this is the work ahead of us, and what we're looking at with the forest companies is what are the free to grow standards? Is there a way to intersect and influence the forest management planning process and the provincial regulations to allow more flexibility for companies to do this kind of, call it climate smart forestry? And then we're bringing everything we can to the table to get rid of herbicide spraying. So mycorrhizal inoculation, manual brushing, pre-harvest vegetation assessments, anything that we can do to reduce the number of hectares that need to be sprayed, even looking at ground-based backpack spraying versus aerial, because you can be more tactical with that. So I hope that answers the questions that were presented.
Yeah, well, there's kind of a follow-up question on, is there a difference between brush cutting and the Quebec Bend and Break program? I'm not familiar with the Bend and Break program, but
Yes, I'm also not familiar with the bend and break program, but if it's as it would be in my head of bending things over and breaking them, sorry for using the terms in the definition. Um, uh, yes, I would have to look at a prescription specifically to see. My guess is if you snapped a tree and just got it out of the way of a crop tree, it's going to damage it. It's going to recover. You're going to get some habitat value out of that and retained diversity in the stand, and it will be less competition with your crop trees. But again, I'm not familiar with bend and break, so that's just a somewhat educated guess.
I have a question for Shayna regarding the wildfire sites. Was fire intensity or burn intensity incorporated into the sites chosen for comparisons?
Um, yeah, I believe that we've classified them into high, moderate, and low intensities. That's really difficult to say on block level because when we're talking about it, we're talking about a larger landscape level for those different categories. So there's lots of variation, I'm sure, at the block level that we can't really manage, especially within the soil and within the seed bank. And I believe that that's where kind of the next step has come, where we're putting environmental designs on either propagating or transplanting different species into areas. So if we do have a higher intensive fire area where we're not seeing the vascular or non-vascular plants that we would expect to see come up, either due to the fire intensity, we're hoping to be able to bring those species back and have some success in propagating or transplanting them. But that's kind of next to come.
Thanks for that. There was a clarification on what bend and break is. Bend and break will cut trees around a crop tree into the cambium only and not fully cut it down.
And I guess is that girdling it as well? Like, or just like cutting into it to damage it enough not to compete? I'm happy to take this offline and have a conversation about that. I have done girdling work before to leave sort of that structure in place for some period of time. But if you go in through the cambium all the way around, the tree's going to die, and that's the chemical girdling as well.
Yeah, and I do apologize to our attendees, but this was set up as a webinar, so there's not an opportunity to raise your hand and for us to allow you to engage directly with our speakers. But just a clarification, oh, I see you're typing, but not girdling, partial cutting, but then bending over. So Leigh, I do have a question about your project because you did say that it is costly. So I'm just wondering what is the best options for, like I know you're doing training guardians to do the work, but what is the feasibility of doing this at like large scales and like, I don't know, like a complete forest management unit. So.
Yeah, so and this is why we're thinking about other sources of finance to support forest management work. So it's very expensive, but if there's a way to certify, say, the biodiversity benefit from avoiding herbicide and quantify that, and you have a buyer on the other side that wants to invest in that work, it can be additional finance for the forest sector to help pay the difference between the helicopter cost and the manual brushing cost. And then there's an incentive to build out that workforce at scale. Like there's kind of two things we're trying to deal with. But, like for example, a helicopter brushing, let's call it $200 a hectare for the glyphosate, just for argument's sake. And manual brushing could be 2,000 a hectare. So am I offering to forever lock in the $200 price and a different quality of product for the forest companies? No. But I'm also not suggesting that they are mandated to pay $2,000 a hectare out of increasingly stressed financial, like your OpEx budget. So I think there's work to do to bring it to the middle, and that some of these alternative sources of finance, I haven't looked specifically at a protocol that can quantify the above ground biomass that's retained and then how that transitions into soil organic carbon storage. But as we get more sophisticated with the monitoring and the measurement piece, maybe that's a kind of a investment opportunity. But right now, we're at a very high level thinking about how to support the forest companies at a time of increasing distress on their books and be able to do better forest management. And part of the research that we've brought in actually connects to ESG investing and distressing firms with a higher cost of capital. And I know that's getting maybe a little bit too technical on the finance side, but basically when firms are stressed out and they're thinking about survival, they can't invest for the long term. And what our forests need in the face of climate change is long-term thinking and long-term investment. So that's where the combination of Indigenous leadership and ecosystem product investment can help support the industry for better outcomes and better forest management.
Sounds good. So this seems to be a follow-up question to that, but it's just, because you'll need a lot of guardians, you'll need a lot of labor to do this work. Do you think it's going to be difficult to find people to do this in the long term? Because it is difficult work, hard work, labor intensive work.
Yeah, I mean, the silviculture workforce is highly mobile and highly motivated by making buckets of money. So it all depends on how much you're willing to pay. But I think part of our theory of change is that if you have local workforces that can be trained at a very high level, that's the solution. Are there enough bodies, and what does that ramp up look like? I don't know. We're testing that right now. Can we get 1,000 brushers in Northern Ontario in short order? I think it depends on how much you want to pay. The labor market is not just a forestry labor market competition. You're in competition with oil and gas, mining, whatever is in your local area. And those companies pay a lot of money for workers. You know, you can be 120 grand a year in the oil patch and not graduate high school, and they're looking for bodies and looking for people that work hard. So that's the labor market competition. And what I've heard from a lot of community members is that there's a desire or an incentive or a premium put on working at home and staying in community. So that's where our workforce program is looking to have a series of opportunities to stay at home and not necessarily have a full-time job, but seasonal work that you want to do.
Sounds good. We are at time here. Unfortunately, there isn't time for any other questions. I do want to just quickly share my contact info here. If you have any follow-up questions, would like to get in touch with our presenters, you can feel free to, I don't know if that went, if that's working. But yeah, this is my email address, and there is a QR code there you can scan, and you can sign up for more information at forest.org/climate smart forestry. You can sign up for newsletters and email list, and as we continue to create materials and information from our Climate Smart Forestry Initiative, we can send you that information. And yeah, it's just any feedback, please send it to sficonservation@forest.org. So I'd like to thank Shayna and Leigh and Lauren for your presentations today. We're excited to be working with you on these projects and look forward to continuing building our partnerships and strengthening those partnerships. So